Experts believe that if the calculation is correct, by the year of 2050, and the number of the population of the world is going to reach 9 billion. That's right. This is not a joke. By the year of 2050, that the world is going to face another major crisis that related to population. However, coming back to the reality today, more and more nations are facing what we call the population decline. For example, China, Japan, and also including the country we are going to talk about, it's South Korea. What is happening today when we talk about the population? Why are those countries are facing the population decline? Is it more about this political agenda or there's something related to this economic inequality? Take a good look at the countries of South Korea, one of the critical countries in Asia, neighboring nation of Japan and China. But some believe that despite the population decline, there are still hopes for the country. And just look at China. How China is actually dealing with the same issue and hopefully can bring some measurements or can bring some hopes to South Korea. Is this really the case? How should we understand the bigger picture? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Professor Lauren Johnston. Professor Johnston is Associate Professor at the University of Sydney's China Studies Center. Well, Professor Johnston, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks so much for having me, Will. It's great to be with you.
Well, Professor, the honor is all mine. Now, let's talk about what's happening in the nation of South Korea. Again, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled South Korea Must Learn from China's Population Long Game. Let's get to the most fundamental question, Professor. What is happening in South Korea today when we talk about this population decline and how concerning it is for the South Korean government? Your thoughts?
So South Korea is infamous today, I guess, for having the world's lowest total fertility rate. So the total fertility rate is something like 0.8 babies per woman of reproductive age. So that's age 15 to 49 by most statistical indicators. And the replacement rate for a population to stay roughly stable over time is 2.1, though they say in Northeast Asian countries, especially China, Korea, that actually it might even be something like 2.3 or 2.4 to accommodate the preference for sons. So just because there tends to be more male births than female births in those countries. So it's obviously way below the replacement rate. And there was an article perhaps 5 years ago, I think in the UK, that said South Korea will be the first country to disappear, just simply because of this kind of compound demographic trend. And in terms of preparing, Korea went through this most amazing economic transformation since 1960. And, the education levels, the per capita income levels, and also the consolidation of this high-tech, high education economy around Seoul as its kind of hub, at least as one of, its main hub. All of these factors play into this demographic change. The opportunities have changed, the ways of living have changed, the cost of living has changed. And in particular, the cost of being productive has probably changed just because, the best opportunities are all in Seoul. So that and then people, a particular generation, the post-war generation, got rich on their housing wealth. And so, to kind of enter into the Seoul economy as compared to the Korean economy probably just takes much more income and getting started and kind of entrance. There's more kind of barriers to entry, should you say, for if you wanted to kind of own an apartment in Seoul that enabled you to get to your job, had a feasible mortgage and allowed you to have two children, plus a visitor, or even just two children with their own bedrooms, is almost inhibitive today. So there's all sorts, let alone the work culture, the hours and so on. There's all sorts of variables that play into this sort of cycle of progress that sort of swallowed its own ability to replace itself. Um, and why I wrote that article is because it was just last month or the month before that the South Korean president declared a demographic emergency. Kind of, this has obviously been a trend that's been just kind of growing slowly over time. It's not like it just happened. But now there's a very explicit and open political conversation about it. Whereas I think there just wasn't all through the 90s, 2000s, as the TFR sort of crash. No one was talking about it. And now it's been declared as a political emergency. And I guess part of that, the background to that is there's a bigger global conversation now. Part of that is, looking at the challenges of Japan, which is kind of a bit the canary in the mine for South Korea. It's older, it's confronting its own population aging challenges, its labor shortages, the imperfection of replacing labor with technology, and the caring economy. How do you care for all these old people? How do you make sure they have a comfortable retirement, and how do you make sure they do that without bankrupting the active economy? If you got to keep funneling public resources into caring for the aged, which is obviously necessary and important, then there must come some sort of point where you're funneling so much of the active economy into the sort of dying economy, so to speak, that you end up kind of atrophizing, if that's a word, the active economy also. It's a bit like a circumstance of debt overhang. In a developing country that has a huge debt burden, development can be inhibited because such a high share of the economic returns of any investment have to be paid in tax to pay off all the debt. And the kind of predictable tax burden is so high that investors don't bother to invest. And so then you get into this vicious circle. And there's a bit of a comparability of that concept with population aging, in the sense of, if you've got this sort of debt burden of old people, and I'm not suggesting that old people are a burden. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't receive those resources. But the simple reality is, if they receive a big enough share, then it puts such a weight on the active economy and young people that they can't afford to repeat the life cycle that the old people enjoyed. And then you kind of get this collapse. Then you don't have enough money to invest in their kids in school, and you don't have enough money to support parents, and you don't have enough money to support, and then the whole kind of system dies. So the greater your weight of your aged population, the bigger that sort of risk is. And it's a little like, 100 or 200 years ago, when, Malthus came up with this Malthusian trap, which was, which was about the rate of population growth exceeding the rate of productivity of agriculture, which basically meant more and more babies, not enough food, we all starve, and we go into war and conflict and stagnation and hunger and famine. There's a bit of a parallel between that concept and population aging, where, the rate of needs and the rate of productive resources kind of utilization of the aged becomes so great that it undermines the active economy to such an extent that it sort of all compound collapses. And so I guess that's what I guess that's what South Korea is. I used to work for a South African organization. I guess that's what South Korea is trying to now avoid. It's kind of reached this peak where it's gone recently into population decline. And that maybe is what's sort of ringing alarm bells that now it's officially a national emergency and they need to work out a long run strategy.
Well, again, Professor Johnston, surely what's happening in South Africa, politically speaking, it's rather interesting. But let's dive into South Korea. Now, I want to go back to the article. Something that you wrote, again, I would love for you to elaborate a little bit more. And I quote, only now is South Korea formulating a dedicated ministry for population strategy and planning, end quote. As you mentioned before, this is alarming issue when we talk about a population decline for South Korea. And this is not the first time that the current government tried to come up with this affordable or even this tangible strategies, or you call it plannings, however you want to address it, try to tackle this issue. Now, Professor Johnston, let's dive into a little bit deeper is what are the specific strategies and plannings actually have been implemented in order to solve this issue? I guess solving is not the right word, but at least raise the awareness. And also you mentioned the younger generations when it comes to economic agenda can really boost the motivation and also provide more incentives to build more families, have more babies, or even honor this traditional value. So again, going back to the question, what are some of the strategies and plannings from the government under current president of South Korea try to minimize the threat of the population decline?
Well, in terms of this population ministry, as I understood it from what was available to read in English language in the news, it's really quite a microeconomic or micro socioeconomic policy focused ministry. So it will do research on exactly all those things, like really dig into what are the barriers to household formation? What are the barriers to family formation? What is the gap between a South Korean woman's desired household and family and what she's realizing and why? And the same for males, I assume. And so what is driving a gap between desired household and family formation and actual household formation? So I guess in terms of the policy specific research, there'll really be a lot of investigation into that with much more resources than has been in the past, and much more policy coordination at higher levels of government to make sure when they identify something obvious or something they can feasibly respond to, that they actually do. So that is the aspect. But in terms of what governments can do, I mean, practice around the world at the moment shows not that much in terms of, Hungary especially is the case of the most generous kind of government subsidies and so on. But they're not under generous in Scandinavia. In terms of like in Hungary, there's all sorts of benefits of, I think a woman who has 4 children can almost live for free, not quite live for free, but free education, free children's education, free sort of everything. Like the bonus of if you produce 4, Hungarians will pay for everything. And that might have fostered a few people to have 4 children, but it hasn't dramatically revolutionized the TFR. On the other hand, sometimes some of the demographic statistics are a little misleading because they're quite long run. So if you judge the effectiveness of a policy over, say, 5 years by the total fertility rate, unless you really, really can isolate the most probable sections of society that's going to impact, then your generic TFR figure, which, as I said, includes all women aged from 15 to 49, typically. So many women will have had their children probably aged between, 24 and 38. But they're still in this figure for, much longer after that. In some cases, there'll be grandmas counted in that figure. And so you might get a boost that is perhaps a bit bigger than what the actual figure you see in the news suggests, because maybe you have this enormous group of women in their 40s who are no longer having children, but they're still in the total fertility rate. And the number of women in their 20s who might be responding to these policy changes, or early 30s, their weight in that indicator is quite small. So there actually might be a bit more of a responsiveness than is sometimes picked up in these sort of headline figures, just because of the way the figure is constructed. So I was at the American Economic Association annual meeting in Texas in January, and there was a speaker from Seoul National University on the panel I was on, and she spoke about exactly that there is a higher than this kind of point 0.8 headline figure total fertility rate now of younger educated women. So that there is a bit more, where she said something like where educated women today in their 40s may have had a quite low total fertility rate, that educated women in their 20s and early 30s demonstrate a higher TFR than those women did. But today they're all lumped in the same total fertility rate. So there's no magic bullet, and every society is trying different things. I don't know of like a super radical experiment of, super cheap housing, or, super subsidies, or super paying for like a babysitters, or do you know what I mean? Super. There's no magic bullet, but perhaps this South Africa. So why do I keep doing that? I'm really sorry. The South Korean. I've just spent almost 2 years working for a South African organization. Why maybe this South Korean ministry will have more teeth and a more scientific approach, and so be able to. But on top of that, I saw something today in the news that there's also maybe an opening towards having foreign workers and so on. So there's many different ways to accommodate population aging and accommodate changing preferences. But I think the key thing policymakers need to look at is, what is the gap between desired household formation and actual household formation? And what really truly are the reasons driving that gap? And how can policy narrow that gap? And maybe and hopefully that's one of the things that this ministry will super dig into, and then with a lot of kind of authority act where they can act to narrow that gap.
Well, one thing I do want to remind our viewers that Professor Johnston is located in Melbourne. And of course, as we are speaking, as we're taping this interview, it's really late for Professor Johnston. So it's totally understandable that after having a long day, and of course, we really appreciate that your availability and also your time to dive into such interesting but a critical topic. Well, with that said, Professor, I got two more questions before letting you go so you can go to bed early. Now, let's talk about China. As you also mentioned in the article, population decline is also happening in China today. I mean, a couple years ago, some believe that China was supposed to be the nation that holds the largest population on the planet. But in the year of 2024, in reality, younger generations today are quietly and slowly walking away from building families, having children. Again, the opposite of the traditional Chinese value. But meanwhile, in your article, you still mention and also touch on delicately that South Korea can actually learn something from China looking at this population long game. So my next question is, What can South Korea actually learn from China, and why is it just China? I mean, again, we're looking at Japan, we're looking at the nation of US and more nations in Europe. I mean, this is not just a South Korean issue. This is a global concern when we talk about population decline. But why China? What are some of the reminders and some of the shortcuts, or even the what we say the strategies that South Korea can borrow and or even to mimic from China? Your thoughts, Professor?
Yeah, thanks again. Yeah, the China story is fascinating in this context, and there isn't a parallel, and the reason there's not a parallel is primarily because of the unusual population policies of the People's Republic. So after the People's Republic was founded, Mao happened to encourage natality, family formation, and that ultimately saw a peak total fertility rate of something like six something, around 1968. And then in the 70s, thanks to, famine, which was also, which had a much bigger background to it, but famine in the late 60s was part of the story that led to what was called the longer, later, fewer, or later, longer, fewer campaign in China, the essence of which was to encourage women to wait longer to start a family, have leave more number of years between each child, and to have fewer children overall. So over the 70s, that saw China's total fertility rate drop from 6 towards 2, and or 2 or 3. So a big decline over that 70s period. But the thing about the 1980s was that this was the period when a lot of the babies born in the 60s would begin to have their own families from that time on. And China, of course, had also just embarked on an opening and reform agenda, care of Deng Xiaoping. And so this was sort of intensified with the one child policy. So that large demographic bubble of the 1960s, had they all had 3 or 4 kids each, that would have slowed down the rate of economic growth, and this one time kind of drive to change China into a much more modern and wealthy place. And secondly, it would have meant a lot of babies because it would have been a lot of people having them. And so that brought about the one child policy. And the one child policy in turn led to a lot of thinking about the relationship between economics and demography, because China was the only place in the world where the government was responsible for the drop in the total fertility rate. And that meant the government had to deliver implicitly on its promise that this drop in the total fertility rate would deliver much improved long run living standards. And this just didn't happen anywhere else in the world. So it makes it a really unique case study. And this happened when China was a really poor country. So that meant in the mid 1980s, some researchers at Renmin University realized China would get old before it would get rich. So having implemented this one child policy, they looked at the sort of demographic trajectory, which was relatively fixed at that point. And they could see that China would get really old in the 2020s because of all those babies would enter from the 60s and so on, would enter retirement. And there wouldn't be nearly as many people of working age to follow them, thanks to this one child policy. So they're like, oh my God, we'll be old before we'll be rich. And they looked at, Japan, they looked at Singapore, they looked at Hong Kong, they looked around the region, they thought, oh my God, they all got rich when they were young. So somehow we have to come up with a way to get rich after we get old. And this kind of led to a bit of creative long-run thinking about we need to make sure that a smaller future workforce is able to be productive enough not only to compensate for that shift to fewer workers and a smaller working age population share, but to kind of carry all those old people, to kind of carry the weight of a huge number of retirees at the same time as continuing to grow the economy, which they thought, oh my God, in the 2020s, we're going to have this nightmare situation where we'll begin to have all these retirees. We won't be a rich country yet. And with fewer workers and fewer people, we're going to have to somehow drive our economy anyway. And they realized that predicament for the 2020s in the 1980s. And so between the 1980s and the 2020s, very crudely, they had this long run strategy of not only maximizing the development potential of China's huge worker boom. So from 1980 to roughly 2010, 15, this enormous population of what I call Mao's babies, their working potential, their productivity potential, maximizing that through foreign investment, through trade, through infrastructure building, through this kind of almost frenzy of low wage, labor intensive productivity, while at the same time as making compulsory education compulsory up until some level of, end of junior school or something, or middle school, and rapidly expanding from the late 1990s when these one child policy kids turned 18, university places. And obviously, China didn't manage to educate its whole population perfectly. It's a very, like the people who benefited from growth and reform most disproportionately also benefited from education more too. But nonetheless, you now have, so if you look today at the average number of years of education of the labor force, it's still quite low because it's biased by this huge number of older workers who barely have any education. But if you look at the average number of years of education of people in their 30s, let's say, in China, much, much, much higher than people in their 30s 30 years ago, like a revolution. So the challenge for China, so in effect, what China did was to kind of accommodate demographic swings into its long run thing. Like population is totally endogenous to China's long run planning. And so they've basically got this agenda of swapping from population quantity to population quality. And now they're trying to push by 2030 that the total fertility rate will be up from, I think today it's something like 1.2, up to 1.8. So, like offering incentives, family supports, subsidies, housing subsidies, education subsidies, pushing it back toward 1.8 by 2030, and then seeing if by 2040 or so they can get it higher again. Because eventually this transition from quantity to quality will obviously run out. So by the time that runs out, by the time the population's on average more educated and so on, then they need closer to the replacement rate for this kind of smooth economic demography trajectory. So what can South Korea learn from that? South Korea can't wind the clock back and copy what China did. Like they've already got rich. They're already per capita very rich, and they're already very old, and they're already extremely educated. So there's not this capacity to swap from labor quantity to labor quality over the next few decades in South Korea. Like they're already on a kind of high education quality spectrum. They're off the spectrum almost. But that doesn't mean there can't be ways to consider that long run conversation, that long run. Like that was the other thing China did was in the 1980s, 90s, by telling its population they'll be old before rich, that conditioned today's older population to understand that they could not expect and would not get super generous pensions or healthcare for the very reason that there were so many of them if they got generous pensions and healthcare, when they were old, China's economy would stagnate. It would collapse under the weight of all these old people, these super expensive pensioners. So there's, as well as this sort of microeconomic focus at the household level, like what do women need, what do mothers need, what's an obstacle to optimal household formation. This sort of long run population productivity weighting, and how do you do that over time and across generations? So a conversation about, I mean, it's a little harder in a democracy because people vote, and if there's a lot of older voters, then you have a bit of a challenge. But nonetheless, there may be a way to foster a kind of a longer run intergenerational economic demography thinking that hasn't been the case in Korea at all, whereas it's been the case in China since the 1980s. And in South Korea's case, the fact they haven't had that conversation might be able to be used to help foster the integration of foreign workers today, because that's what they need to do to compensate for the lack of workers. Or they might be able to use that to foster a different level of accommodation of government support for younger families, or taxes on the wealth of old people, once there's an understanding that the opportunities had by today's old population might have been disproportionate across everyone's lifetimes. Then perhaps there's a way to tax some aspects of the older population that don't exist otherwise, and then that can be used to be planted back into the working age population. So this sort of longer cross-generational economic planning in China, there may be ways to use an overlapping generations understanding of productivity weighting over time to help shift policy preferences or policy interventions in South Korea. But is it possible to replicate what China did? No, not at all, for all sorts of reasons, besides which is now far too late. But at least to accommodate that long run angle, and not only look at this kind of micro interventions like what do women need, what do children need, to really look at the productivity weight and burden of different cohorts over time and their lifetime economic opportunity, and to weight that and then be able to shift the tax and fiscal system accordingly also.
What is happening in South Korea in terms of this population decline, or even the government called it demographic crisis, it's alarming. It's not just about South Korea, it's not just about China. In order to solve this issue, to show this economic agenda, to show this economic quality, it's essential to every single country today. So hopefully that, again, we are seeing more practical, useful strategies out of the South Korean government, able to bring something beneficial, not just for the workforce, but also really for younger generations to understand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Lauren Johnston. Again, Professor Johnston, it's Associate Professor at the University of Sydney's China Studies Center. Well, Professor Johnston, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we love to have you back on the show for future episodes as we continue to pay attention to the population issue and also the matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.